This is a 1991 Peugeot 505 Turbo SW8, and it's the very best version of the very last car that Peugeot ever sold in the United States. 1991 was Peugeot's last year here in America, and this was the end of the line, and today I'm going to review it. Before I get started, be sure to check out Cars and Bids, which is my enthusiast car auction website with cool cars from the modern era. We've had some great sales recently on Cars and Bids, including this 2009 Porsche Cayman S, which sold for $42,500, this gorgeous Hellcat Challenger in this wonderful lime green, which brought $41,500, and this Chevy Suburban fire truck, I love the weird stuff, sold for $9,300, an excellent car for Cars and Bids. If you're looking to sell your enthusiast car from the modern era, the 1980s and up, Cars and Bids is the place to do it. And if you're looking to buy a cool enthusiast car, check out Cars and Bids with daily auctions and great selection at carsandbids.com. So let's talk 505. Peugeot was the very last French car brand to sell cars here in the United States. Renault and Citroën had given up years earlier. Peugeot made it all the way through 91, but then they too gave up, and they haven't been back since. Now at the end, Peugeot was selling two models here in the US. There was the 405, which was smaller, and then there was the 505, the flagship model, and this was the very best version. And today, I'm going to review it. First, I'll take you on a thorough tour of the 505 and show you all of its quirks and features. Then I'll get it out on the road and drive it, and then I'll give it a Doug score. Alright, I'm going to start the quirks and features of this 505 Turbo with probably its most interesting quirk, at least by modern standards, and that would be its seating configuration. Check this out. You get two seats up front, which is pretty standard. Then in the back you have a bench seat with three seats across, also pretty standard. But then you have another bench seat behind that, forward facing, also with three seats, three seat belts. So this car seats 8 passengers, which is a pretty impressive feat, especially considering its size. This Peugeot Wagon is only 2 inches longer than a new Toyota Camry, meaning that in the footprint of a Toyota Camry, a mid-size 5-passenger sedan, they've created an 8-passenger wagon, which is a pretty good piece of packaging, and it's even more impressive than that. Most station wagons with a third row seat have a rear-facing third row, and that way the third row shares its legroom with the cargo area of the station wagon. But this car has a forward-facing third row, meaning that it has legroom and there's also a separate cargo area beyond that. So this has legroom for 3 different rows of seats and also a cargo area, all in the size of a Toyota Camry. It really is impressive packaging, and you can see the third row seat's legroom is actually pretty decent. It's not like pushed right up against the second row or incredibly compact. There's decent space back there for third row passengers in this vehicle. It really is an unusual feat of seating arrangement. But anyway, next up, speaking of interior room and packaging in the 505, another impressive feat is the fact that the cargo space is actually pretty good. Open up the tailgate and you can see the cargo area has decent room even behind the third row. So you do have enough cargo space for some stuff even after you load up 8 passengers in this wagon. It really is excellent packaging. And just in case you need even more space, that's pretty easy to get. You see this latch over here on the side of the third row seat, just pull on it, push the seat back forward, and then you have extra cargo space. And in case you need even more space or a flat load floor, you can also lift up the seat bottom of this third row, lift it, the seat clears out of the way, and then you have even more space and obviously a flat floor for a large cargo area in the back of your 505. And you can also put down the second row. There's a little lever on the side of the second row seat. You can pull that and fold the backrest forward, which is useful, or you can kind of lift it again and pull the entire seat forward and then clear the second row seats out of the way for even more cargo space in the back of this 505. The owner of this car told me he's a cyclist. He can get bicycles back here or even a bed to sleep back here, which is an added and interesting benefit if you get a 505 wagon. Pretty decent sizing in here. But my very favorite thing about the rear cargo area tailgate situation in the 505 has nothing to do with the cargo space or the seats, but rather the warning label printed on the base of the tailgate. Okay, so you go to load your items or unload them, you're done doing that, you close the tailgate, you reach up and you see this, which is a warning label letting you know not to grab the tailgate in this place, which is like the natural place you would go to grab a tailgate in order to close it. And worse, it doesn't provide like a handle or a strap to grab onto instead. It just tells you don't grab here where you normally grab, and otherwise it's just up to you to figure out what to do. I've never seen a warning label like that on a tailgate before, especially printed right there where you would want to grab it, and it tells you not to. That's some good thinking, Peugeot. But anyway, next we move on to the back seat in the 505 wagon, and the first thing you notice when you climb in here as an adult is that there's not all that much space. In fact, you can clearly tell that this is probably where Peugeot skimped on some of the interior room in order to create a roomy third row and a cargo area. The back seat is pretty tight up against the front seats, especially if you have the front seat positioned where a taller adult like me would sit. You don't have a lot of space in the back seats. And that's not just a problem with leg room, it's also a problem with headroom. This car has kind of stadium seating where each row is higher than the previous one. You can see the front seats are on the floor, the back seats are kind of higher, and the third row is higher still. But that means that each successive row of seats has less and less headroom. So sitting back here, my head is kind of tilted, my knees are pushing into the front seats, a little tight in the back of this car. But aside from the rear seat room issues with this car, nothing too unusual or interesting back here except for the placement of the rear window switches, which is right here between the front seats, sort of at the back of the front center console. That's where they stuck them. You don't have rear window switches on the back doors like in virtually every car. Instead, they're there. Now, this is an obvious cost-cutting move because usually front passengers like to have access to control the rear windows, and so do rear passengers. Most cars give the driver controls for all windows on the driver's door panel and then separate controls on the back doors for rear passengers. But here they figured just stick them in between everybody and then everyone can control the windows, which is cost-cutting, and it makes rolling down the windows not especially convenient. Also in this same spot you have a cigarette lighter, which is the rear cigarette lighter, obviously important. In Europe in the 70s and 80s, everyone smoked, including your rear passengers, and you had dual ashtrays back here as well, one on each door. So they could put ashtrays on the doors, but not window switches. But anyway, next we move up to the front in the 505, and this is where some rather interesting and quirky things really start to reveal themselves, starting with the seat belts, which are quite interesting. You have a lap belt, which you move across your lap and buckle in, like a lot of cars did from this era. That's not that surprising. The unusual part is you also have a second belt, which you can see here. This belt you're supposed to pull across your chest and then attach to a buckle that's over your shoulder. Stick that in, and then you're buckled across your chest in addition to your lap. Now, this gave you a 3-point seat belt, which even by the late 80s and early 90s was already clearly safer than lap belts that were common in the 60s and 70s. But they did it in a weird way. Specifically, the belt buckle is actually attached to the door. You can see I open the door here and the belt buckle opens with the door. And that meant if you had buckled yourself across the chest, you couldn't actually open the door until you unbuckled yourself, which made things a little bit strange, but that's how it worked. Now, attaching this belt buckle to the door also meant that Peugeot didn't have to deal with those electronic belt buckle things that slid up a track over the door every time you got in the car, like a lot of 80s and early 90s cars had. Instead, you had this solution for a 3-point belt, which was a pretty neat idea. The only drawback being that they had to install 2 belts and 2 buckles in every car. And each time you got in, you had to go through a 2-step process. Buckle your lap and then buckle buckle your chest, but you did get a 3-point belt out of it. Kind of interesting. But anyway, moving on to the rest of the front of this interior, it is very 1980s in here, which means a lot of plastic, which was common on 80s and early 90s cars, and a lot of right angles. You don't have a lot of curves and cool style in here. Instead, it's boxes and 90-degree angles everywhere you look, and plastic everywhere too. A couple of things worth pointing out in here. For one thing, the front window switches are mounted here, as you can see, right in the center. So you have the front and rear window switches relatively close together. Easy reach for front passengers, although not rears. You also have this automatic transmission gear selector, which you can see is just a tall stick with sort of a T shape, like a lot of 80s, early 90s auto gear selectors were. Not attractive, not beautiful. No one could get away with this today, but this sort of thing was common in its period. Also unusual up here, at least by modern standards, is the climate controls, which you can see are arranged vertically. You have one slider for temperature on the right, and then the middle slider is for fan speed, of course. And then over on the left, a row of buttons letting you direct the air where you wanted it to go. You heat your air conditioning, all your climate controls here. Also interesting, in this center control stack, you have this little panel with what exactly is that diagram? I couldn't figure it out for a couple of minutes, and then it became clear that's a bag of money, like a cartoon character might steal from a bank in a 50s cartoon. Like Daffy Duck might run around with a bag of money like that with a dollar sign on the side, and it's printed there because this is your coin storage. You open up this panel, and that's where you put your coins, your bag of money. Why not just print a diagram of a coin? Not sure. You got your money bag instead. Now, right below that, you have another panel with a cigarette on it. Obviously, this is your ashtray, and you have a separate cigarette lighter here. So 2 cigarette lighters within, I don't know, maybe 30 inches in this interior, which showed you where the priorities of the French were in the late 80s and early 90s. Next up, some other important items to point out here. For one thing, heated seats. You can see buttons for them right here, left and right, 2 heated front seats, which is pretty impressive. Not a lot of cars had this in the early 90s, but this one did. But anyway, next up, another rather unusual control is to the left of the steering wheel. You can see mounted kind of under the dashboard, sort of hidden, is this button with an X and then arrows going up or down. You might be wondering what exactly that is. Turns out that's the rear window lockout. So if your kids are being annoying playing with the windows back there, you press that and then they can't control the windows anymore, except you only have one set of rear window controls. So if you press the rear window lockout, the rear passengers are locked out from controlling the windows, but so are you. No one can control the windows. You're going to destroy this village in order to save it. But anyway, other interesting items in this car. One is the sunroof control. You have a little switch mounted here that has 2 positions. One has a little panel that's sort of open. That's tilting the sunroof up for a vent. The other one has like a sun in a square, and that would be opening the sunroof all the way to let in the sun. Kind of an interesting approach to diagrams on that switch, but that's what you had. Also on the sunroof, you have a little sunshade that you can push back, like you have in most cars. Not that unusual. The strange part is that it has a name. Peugeot called it the Skylight. As you can see, it's called that right here. And of course, light is spelled in the very 1980s L-I-T-E to stand out from the standard boring spelling. But anyway, other interesting items in this interior. For one thing, inside the glove box, you can see the Peugeot 505 owner's manual. You open it up to an early page and it proudly proclaims, "Your Peugeot is a fine piece of precision machinery." I'm not sure how many Peugeot owners would vouch for that, but that's the claim it made in the owner's manual. Now, also in this owner's manual, it gives the address of Peugeot's U.S. operations as 1 Peugeot Plaza in Lyndhurst, New Jersey. Peugeot got the street renamed just for them. A big foreign company coming to the United States to set up a major headquarters. But of course, right after this car was made, they completely went out of business and haven't been back. I looked up where this is now, and let's just say the street isn't called that anymore, and there's now a Subway there. So you can get a sandwich where you could once find the Peugeot headquarters. And next up, another interesting item in this interior would be the warning chimes that this car has. I love the little sound they make. They sound like little bells. Take a listen to the chimes when you first get in. And speaking of the warnings in this car, I absolutely love the warning that lets you know your seatbelt isn't buckled. You get inside, start the car, and it warns you and it chimes to tell you your belt's not buckled, but then that all goes away. It just warns you for a few seconds. It's not actually linked to your seatbelt. So it doesn't know whether you've buckled it or not. It's just letting you know, hey, please buckle it. Okay, see ya. And then it stops completely, which isn't really the highest quality warning, but that's what it does. Now, also in this gauge cluster, worth pointing out one cool thing in here, you got a turbo boost gauge. These days, most cars are turbocharged, but back in the late 80s, early 90s, it was pretty uncommon. But this car's got a boost gauge because it's got a turbo. Yes, that's right. This 505 wagon was turbocharged. Like I said, this was the top of the line model in 91, and that meant it got the big power. Specifically, a turbocharged 4-cylinder that made 160 horsepower. Not a lot by modern standards, but it was more than the base model engine, which was just a naturally aspirated 4-cylinder that only had 120 horsepower. And frankly, both of those were more than earlier diesel versions of this car that had under 100 horsepower, like 95 horsepower in a vehicle the same length as a modern Toyota Camry. Those must have been really slow. This thing, probably not incredibly fast, but at least it had more power thanks to the turbo. Now, one drawback of the 505 turbo is that all of these came with an automatic transmission. This was the top of the line model, and that was the thing you did back in the 80s or 90s. The top line version got an automatic, which was seen as a top line upgrade like you would want if you were getting a car like this. So they never made the turbo with the manual. You could only get it with an auto. With that said, these were rear wheel drives. They had a little bit of enthusiast credibility, but auto only. And speaking of enthusiast credibility, you take your 505 to a car show and pop the hood. People can check out your 4-cylinder, and they can also check out this label that says made in France, US model in giant print under the hood, just to let everybody know that this is the US version of a French car. Kind of funny to see that. But speaking of this being a French car, let's talk through exactly what this car was in its period, because we don't get French cars in the US, and most of my North American viewers probably won't quite understand where this car fit in the model range. So, like I said, the 505 was Peugeot's flagship model in the United States. They also had an entry-level model called the 405, and then there was this, the larger, more powerful, more expensive 505. Think of it as sort of like the Audi A4 and the A6 today, with the 405 and the 505. Now, the 505 was initially offered as either a sedan or a wagon, but at the very end of the production run, Peugeot stopped offering the sedan, leaving only the wagon, this model, and it was called the SW8, which stood for Station Wagon with 8 seats. SW8, that's why they called it that. Not exactly clever, but that was the naming. Now, these cars were positioned as sort of entry-level luxury cars at the time. So the closest rival to the 505 was probably the Volvo 740, which matched up in terms of sizing, pricing, and engine power. Other rivals would include the Saab 9000, although they didn't offer that as a wagon. It was a 5-door hatchback, and the Audi 5000, which you could get as a sedan or a wagon as well. This car also kind of competed against Japanese rivals like the Toyota Cressida at the time, the Nissan Maxima, and the Mazda 929. Those were all about the same size or a little cheaper, and they didn't offer a wagon version or the European feel of a Peugeot or a Volvo, but they were sort of competitors. One car this did not compete with was the Mercedes-Benz 300e. That was also available, similar horsepower, similar sizing, but it was more expensive. It had more solid feel. The Mercedes-Benz brand name was stronger, and so that was positioned as sort of a premium luxury car, and this was an entry-level luxury car. And speaking of pricing, let's talk about that. An entry-level 505 in 1991 cost around $18,500, which is equivalent to around $40,000 in today's money. Meanwhile, this car, the top-of-the-line SW8 turbo version, was about $26,000 back back in '91, which is roughly $55,000 in today's money. Big money for this car, but it was on par with rivals at the time. And finally, last thing worth discussing with the 505 would be its styling. I always felt that these cars look deeply 1980s with their sort of body side molding and their chrome trim around the windows and just the general overall design of this car. How about this straight line in the back going down from the roof on the tailgate? Very, very 1980s look to this car, which is actually kind of a compliment because the 505 originally came out at the very end of the 1970s. So its design was actually pretty forward looking and a little bit trend setting as kind of one of the early pioneers of an 80s design car. And indeed, this was created by Peugeot in partnership with Pininfarina, who's famous for their vehicle design. And I think it was a nice looking car ahead of its time, but very 1980s in its appearance. Now, here in the United States, this car never really became successful. Like I mentioned, a sedan and a wagon were originally offered when this car came out in the early 80s. And right away, they were okay sellers, in part because of the available diesel engine. We were just coming out of the 1970s energy crisis. People wanted fuel-efficient cars, and diesel was kind of a way to go. And in 1981, Peugeot's peak sales year in the United States, they sold about 16,000 of these, which was a decent number at the time. But as the 80s went on and other brands started to catch up and offer smaller cars and diesels of their own, Peugeot's advantage started to decline, and by the end, sales were an absolute trickle, virtually none of these being sold in the final model years, which makes this one especially rare. Now, it's worth pointing out that although these weren't tremendously popular in the United States, this car was a huge success across the world outside North America. In fact, Peugeot made about 1.35 million 505 models throughout its production run in the 1980s. And when Peugeot was done making these, they licensed the body, the tooling, the design to companies around the world. And this car stayed in production for years afterwards, even in China through the late 1990s, being made just like this car, which came out in 1979. And it was pretty impressive. This car, a global icon around the world. In Africa today, you still see these all over. They just aren't common in the United States. And so those are the quirks and features of the rather quirky Peugeot 505 Turbo. Now it's time to get it out on the road and see how it drives. All right, driving the 505 Turbo. This review is interesting. I know that nobody is going to watch this video. I know it's not going to get that many views, and it's not going to inspire incitement like doing a Bugatti or a new, even a new car, any Land Rover or Nissan Z, any of that stuff. It's just not going to be popular. But I have always wanted to review one of these cars for a couple reasons. The biggest is I've always seen them around. They've always sort of been peripherally around, and that's true of anybody who lives in America and is sort of my age. You've seen them once or twice here or there, maybe once a year. You see one on the street and you're like, that's weird. And you've always kind of wondered about it. I knew as a kid that this was sold in the United States, but I've never really been in one. Some neighbor across the street had one, but they've become more and more uncommon over the years. And finding a nice one is now to the point where it's virtually impossible. But this is a nice one. The owner of this car reached out and said, hey, I have this, and do you want to come check it out? And I just knew I wasn't going to find another one like this, and so I wanted to see what it was all about. And the other reason that I wanted to drive it and review it is because ultimately these were really popular cars globally, and even though they weren't that popular in the States, it's kind of interesting to see, hey, what was going on, in the rest of the planet throughout the 80s, and in some markets even the early and mid 1990s. So let's talk 505 driving experience. The simple truth about this car is it drives fine, but it doesn't drive like some amazing thing, we missed out on, the French really know how to make them. People say that about like the Citroën DS with its special suspension and other Citroëns with the hydropneumatic suspension, and they had some weird quirks and all that. This car isn't on that level. This car is actually relatively straightforward, especially for a French car. It's unusually normal in here. Now, I don't want to say it's incredibly normal. It's weird to have 3-row seating in a station wagon, especially all facing forward. And some of the other quirks in this car are kind of unusual. Heated cloth seats is a little bit weird. Obviously, the turbo powertrain was strange in its time, but mostly this car is just really not all that unusual. And I reviewed a few kind of late 80s, early 90s cars recently, and this is a lot like a lot of them. I recently reviewed the Mitsubishi Sigma, which is sort of Mitsubishi's full-size car at the time. Would have been sort of a competitor with this, and it was fairly similar. You know, it was a larger sedan, decent interior room, somewhat luxurious, but not an amazing car in any capacity. And that's true here too. This car drives reasonably on the road. It's nice and, you know, relatively stable, but it doesn't feel like a Mercedes-Benz from this era. That part is certainly true. It doesn't have that solidity or stability. It feels like a Volvo or a Saab from this era, which is to say fine, but not like amazing or incredible or something, you know, oh, I wish that they stayed in the United States. It just kind of drives like a late 80s, early 90s car. And that's the same is true for performance. I floor the accelerator. Now on the freeway, it's especially slow. I put it down, I'm going 80, 81, 82, 83, 84, 85. I mean, seriously, it is slow. Around town, it was a little bit quicker. And when you got into the turbo, it actually felt pretty quick, but it's a 4-speed auto. So on the freeway, it's not really got much, you know, there's not much downshifting it can do ultimately, especially at this speed. Frankly, I think the thing about this car that makes it special and interesting and worthy of a review is just the novelty of it. Peugeot was barely selling cars in the United States, especially by the end. The early 90s, 91 was the last year. This was probably one of the very last cars destined for the United States in the entire history of the French automobile industry. It's interesting because in the States, we just don't really have that perspective quite as much. But cruising around in this car, I mean, it feels like a car of its era. And I think the principal complaints about this car at the time were reliability issues and a lack of a dealership network. Peugeot just hadn't gone after making a big push for this market. And so there wasn't a dealership network, and the cars weren't particularly tuned for American taste. You had a Turbo 4 instead of a V6. You had kind of this weird French-looking body style and some French-looking controls, and the car just wasn't a huge success. And it's interesting to see how the French approach like a full-size sedan or a full-size wagon in this case, especially in the context of knowing what, you know, the other brands did, Volvo and Acura and Nissan and all that. Well, here's the French take. And frankly, it's not as different as you might expect. Certainly other French cars in this period were weirder. And so that's the Peugeot 505 Turbo. This is a tremendously interesting car because, well, it's 30 years old and it's the last gasp of the French automotive industry here in America. Very cool to check it out, and I'm thrilled I had the chance to give it a full review. And now it's time to give a Doug score to the 505 Turbo SW8. And the Doug score is here, 42 out of 100, which places the 505 SW8 here against other relatively similar cars from this era. Family cars, including some SUVs. Obviously, it's not quite on the level of luxury models like the BMW 750iL or the Lexus LS400, but the 505 is a special and quirky car that turns way more heads than virtually anything else you can buy at this price point. The owner told me he bought it for under $6,000. Ultimately, this is a very neat car and an interesting window into the last gasp of French cars in the United States.